you have some exciting news regarding the recruiting progress just here in the last few weeks, Nathan. So I'll let you get things underway, and you guys can take off from there because the commits are pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Brian would agree with this. A lot of it has to do with new defensive coordinator Marcus Freeman. Landing Joshua Burnham out of Michigan, a kid that was probably trending towards Michigan most of the cycle until Freeman came on board and kind of flipped the script there. He did the same thing with the kid named Tyson Ford, out of Missouri, about a month prior to that. So two really good, linebacker, defensive end type prospects there. And then before that, they landed Jaden Nicky, a cornerback out of California, who is a top target there. I think they have some other corners on the board they like a little bit more, but Mickey's a really talented kid out of California, and a 4-star guy. And another thing I think Brian would agree with here is on most cycles, this might be their top corner. And this cycle, it might, maybe be their third corner if all goes, according to plan with the staff. And so those are definitely probably the three big commits over the last, couple of months or so. I know Brian will talk about those as well, but they've landed a few others too.
I think the thing for me, Nathan, is a lot of the guys you mentioned, they were not on the radar. They were on the radar, but they weren't a top 2 or 3 school for those guys. Penn State was considered the clear leader for Aiden Guevara until Marcus Freeman shows up. And same thing with Tyson Ford. Some people have reported he was a silent commitment to Oklahoma. Oklahoma was clearly trending. And I think Mike Elson was doing a good job there. But what we're seeing with Marcus Freeman is to recruit at the elite level, it can't be just the position coach. It has to be the position coach, the defensive coordinator. It has to be a bit more of a team type of thing. And when you throw what Mike Elson has done with Marcus Freeman, and you show what Mike Mickens has done, and then you bring in Marcus Freeman, I think that tag team approach has been far more effective. And what we're seeing from this group of defensive coaches especially, they're more willing to compete against the big boys, so to speak. They're not afraid to go into Michigan and compete for a kid that's been in Michigan lean forever. They're not afraid to go down to Texas and battle. They're not afraid to go out to California and battle. They're going after kids in Florida a lot more aggressively. They're going after, Kamari Rogers. Is this going to be a tough haul? Yeah, but you know what? You're always going to miss out on that kid when you don't try. And I think that's the thing we're seeing from this defensive staff. They're far more aggressive. Now, they're going to miss on most of them, but you only need 2 or 3 kids a year to get that you're not normally getting to kind of close that gap and take that next step. And especially at corner, they're going after some big boys after what was a great corner class last year, in my opinion.
Right. No, absolutely. I think, you mentioned Kamari Rogers, another kid who's a good friend of his, and Jair Brown, who's a current Ohio State commit. They're hard after him. There's obviously a few other guys on the board there. I know they've been kind of talking to Jaden Gold, who's actually a fellow teammate right now of Notre Dame's current QB commit, Stephen Angeli, who I think me and you both like to a certain degree. I know at least we've talked kind of in the past about this, that maybe we had some guys higher on our board. Yeah. I think in general, he brings, some stuff to the table. Big kid, kind of actually a little reminds me of Jack Cohen, the guy that did the from Wisconsin to be the guy this year. Not sure if he's a game changer in the sense, maybe a Tyler Buckner, if he ever hits that ceiling. But I know you have kind of some thoughts on Angeli as well.
Yeah, look, he's a solid quarterback, and my criticism of Angeli is not that he's not a good player. Is he a player that you should be recruiting at Notre Dame in year 12 to take that next step? I don't really see that, and I'm going to give the coaching staff a little bit of a pass. I was very critical of the taking of Angeli, but I think they had a hard time adapting their recruiting philosophy at quarterback because of the pandemic, because they couldn't get kids on campus, because they couldn't go through the camps. I think their last 3 or 4 quarterbacks they've signed were kids that they worked out in person on campus, and they were like, okay, that's our guy. They got to see it. And I think they were slow to adjust their philosophy in the 2022 class, and it left them behind some guys that otherwise maybe they would have been able to get had they got on it sooner. What I like, however, is that they're already correcting that mistake. They're already going after some of the top 2013 quarterbacks. There's a kid out in California whose name I'm not even going to try to butcher on this show, who's a top player. They already offered him. Dante Moore from Michigan, they offered a scholarship yesterday. Nathan, I don't know if you've seen that kid, but he's outstanding. And those are the things you have to do. You have to get in early with these kids, these top level kids. You can't be 6 months behind Alabama and 6 months behind Ohio State and Clemson if you're going to get these kids. And that's the thing I like that I'm seeing from the staff is they're being more aggressive. And it's going to result in, like I said, it's just 1 or 2 kids a year on both sides of the ball. That's the difference. And quarterback is one of those. And Tyler Buckner's got a chance to be that. But the difference between Notre Dame and Clemson is Clemson gets one of those guys kind of every other year. Ohio State gets those guys a little bit more regular. You know, they got Kyle McCord last year, who's a top 50 recruit, and they follow that up with the number 1 recruit in the country. That's the kind of thing you need to do if you're going to take that next step. And that's where offensively they're still lagging behind. I think defensively they're starting to show a little bit more aggressiveness in that regards.
And
Right.
I love the Nathan here real quick. I'll just get this in because I want to set Brian up for later in the conversation. As you guys get granular, I love it. Personnel breakdowns, just keep going. But I will want to flag down Brian before we get off here later in this hour. I don't know how much time you have, Brian, but I will, since it's the first time you've been on, love to get the take on Brian Kelly's work, his performance, and the broad view of where Notre Dame football stands. What's the difference between Notre Dame and the elite? You're alluding to it in regards to the recruiting process versus Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State. So we'll get to that point. But you guys take off on these commits.
I was just gonna say, I mean, you mentioned Dante Moore. One of the kids they offered yesterday. I think he's ranked 12th right now on 24/7 Sports. So, I mean, clearly they're just from a ranking standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier too, just you're not always going to land everybody, but then they offer Arch Manning, who's one of the greatest, one of the big quarterback recruits in the 2023 class. Obviously, people know the last name, son of Cooper Manning and nephew of Eli and Peyton. So, I mean, probably not going to land him, but at least it's a kid that you're getting at, like you said, and you can't win battles if you don't get it on.
That's the thing is, the response of, well, you're not going to get him. He's not going to go to Notre Dame. I think Peyton visited Notre Dame back then. Obviously, that was, I think, a year after they had gotten Ron Paulus. But look, they probably won't get Arch Manning, but they definitely aren't going to get him if they don't offer him. Dante Moore. Well, yeah, you're not going to get him if you don't offer him. Kamari Rogers from Mississippi, the 2022 cornerback, that to me is a game changer for Notre Dame. You're not going to get him if you don't go after him and go after him hard. And that's the thing we're seeing. I think Clark Lee was a phenomenal defensive coordinator. I mean, tremendous defensive coordinator. And I think he was a good evaluator of talent, like a really good evaluator of talent. The problem was he was way too methodical to be able to recruit at Notre Dame like you need to recruit. Now that's going to work at Vanderbilt, I believe, because you're not going to fill your class up early on. You're going to have to find some of those developing players that maybe have jumps as seniors. But at Notre Dame, it often left them kind of behind the 8 ball. I mean, a place like Notre Dame should never whiff at linebacker and safety in the same class. And that's exactly what happened in 2020 class. And the big reason for that was they were just so late getting in on these kids. By the time they finally went through the evaluation process and settled on kids, they had missed out on guys. So I think what we're seeing from this staff is a lot more aggressiveness, but also being willing to overlook, hey, maybe this guy doesn't have the 6'2", 38-inch arms or whatever that they're looking for, but this kid can play football. And I think Jaden Mickey's a perfect example. I don't think he's a player Notre Dame would have moved as quickly on a year ago. And I think it would have probably cost them a guy like Jaden Mickey. I think the fact that they said, hey, look, this kid has a lot of the football skills we look for. As a sophomore, he was super productive. We had John Garcia from SL American on our show this morning, and this is what he talked about. Look, you're talking about a kid that plays against St. John Bosco, Mater Dei, Orange Lutheran. And as a sophomore, he's got 6 picks, and he's in double-digit in passes defense as a sophomore. You got to look at some point in time for production, and that's what I like about this staff. They like the length. They want the intangibles and the tools and the measurables. But at the end of the day, if a kid can play football, you go get him. And that's what I like about it. I think that aggressiveness is going to pay off. Maybe it doesn't pay off as much in 2022, although it's, like you said, paid off a little bit. But I think it's really going to be a benefit to Notre Dame when you look at that 2023 class. On defense, offense, there's still some other question marks, but defensively, at least, we're seeing a big jump.
Right. And I think specifically, I mean, defensive line and linebacker recruiting looks to be taking that jump right now. I mean, they already have Burnham and Ziegler in the class, who's obviously Ziegler was committed prior to Marcus Freeman anyway, but I know me and you both like his skill set and what he can do. But they're in on a lot of linebackers. I mean, again, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, but
Tuihalamaka.
Tuihalamaka out of California, Mater Dei. I mean, he's out of Bishop Alamania.
Bishop Alamania, yeah.
Ephesians Prysock is a corner recruit that they're in on from the same program.
He might be the longest cornerback I've ever seen in my entire life.
Well,
no, seriously. I saw a picture of him yesterday where he was in a stance at the line of scrimmage, and I swear he could have been putting his fingers on the top of the grass. His arms are incredibly long. It's like,
yeah.
He's the kind of guy that I look for, Nathan. You talk about him. He's an under the radar guy. There's other corners that are higher on the board, but the thing I love about him is he brings some of that versatility that I think is an absolute must in a 5 DB defense, which is ultimately what Marcus Freeman wants to do. Notre Dame was a 4-2-5 under Mike Elko and Clark Lee, but they weren't a true 4-2-5 because the 5 is supposed to mean 5 DBs. When they've had Drew Tranquil, Osmar Bilal, and Jeremiah Wusu-Koromoa is that guy, and those are linebackers essentially. So you have a guy like that who brings that length. The advantage to having more of a traditional long DB in that nickel role, that slot role, is it provides you more coverage potential. And that's what made Jeremiah Wusu-Koromoa so unique, because he could cover like a DB. Those guys are hard to find, though. You know, those 215 to 220-pound guys that are true linebackers and how they play, but can cover like that's why he's going to be a first-round pick. But if you can find a DB that can be a force against the perimeter pass, against the perimeter runs, but they can cover, that's a huge asset. And the other thing about those long guys like Ephesians Prysock is you don't have to be a 4-4 guy to be effective, because you may have a step on me, but when I stick my go-go gadget arms out, I'm going to be able to make that same play that the 5'11 guy that runs a 4-4 is going to be able to make.
Right.
And that's what I really like about him. He could be a corner. He could be a boundary corner when he gets stronger. I think he could play the field to certain, in more of a zone type of guy. He can play the slot. And if he fills out, I think he could play some safety too. That middle of the field when you're playing cover one, that kind of rangy, deep center fielder kind of guy. He's an interesting guy that people may say, well, they're just recruiting him to get Tuihalamaka. And I'm like, well, so? Because he can ball too. I mean, that kid can play. And I do like the fact, and I want to ask you this, Nathan. Have you noticed that they seem to be a lot more active in the Southwest and West Coast this year than they have been in recent years? I mean, they've got some guys from the West Coast, obviously Buckner, Isaiah Foskey, but they seem to be a lot more involved with more players from California, Arizona, and Texas than we've seen in past years. A lot more aggressiveness there. And I think that's going to pay off because Arizona is an up-and-coming state that's producing a lot more high-level talent than it has in the past. And a lot of those kids are transplants. They're not native Arizonians or whatever you call it. And I think that's another area, kind of like Atlanta has been to Notre Dame, where I think they could have some success if they're willing to go in there, and they're starting to do that. Obviously got Tosh Baker, and I like the fact that they're being more aggressive in those states, especially since Texas is, not Texas yet. I mean, see if you can steal a kid or two from there. I think it's a smart strategy, and I like the aggressiveness they're showing out there.
I was going to mention specifically, I mean, I know yesterday they had the 30 or so offers that went out, and a lot of them were in Texas and specifically in the South. You had a lot of Florida kids as well. But no, I mean, you mentioned it. You mentioned Arizona. I mean, obviously they're in on Anthony Lucas, the defensive tackle. I think 24/7 Sports has him as a 5-star billing right now.
He's a beast. That kid that's a program changer kind of kid, in my opinion.
Right, exactly. And I think Deuce Robinson out of the 2023 class,
teammate of Tosh Baker.
Yeah, same school as Tosh Baker. I think Morrison, the corner. I think he's a 2022 corner. I'm not sure how involved they are. I think they just made his top 10 or whatever, but he's another kid out of Arizona. And you're right. I mean, they're not typically, too heavily involved in those states. I've noticed, I mean, I'm a Nevada guy, and I've noticed actually recently they're kind of getting back into Bishop Gorman, which is a huge program. Obviously Alize Mack, Nico Fertitta, Ronnie Stanley specifically are 3 guys that went to Notre Dame from Bishop Gorman. Being in on Cyrus Moss this year, they offered a couple of his teammates. I think one's committed to USC right now. And then I think they just offered another kid out of Nevada yesterday who's actually Desert Pines, which is interesting because you guys probably don't know Desert Pines like I know Desert Pines. But that's not typically a high school that you would think of for Notre Dame. It's a public school. It's sort of in a bad area of town. But they produce a lot of talent. And a lot of those kids go to USC. A lot of those kids go to Oregon, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think this kid had an Alabama offer, so he's obviously doing something right at the high school level. And happy to see that they're getting on some Las Vegas talent. Because just like what you said with Arizona, a lot of kids that play in Vegas aren't necessarily from Vegas originally. They're transplants from California specifically. But Vegas in general, even without that, has a lot of high school talent at both the basketball and the football level. And it's good to see Notre Dame getting involved there.